repeated use by regimes throughout history of a manipulative technique wherein the care and love and concern and compassion in the human heart is weaponized and used to support policies which are politically and economically to the advantage often of those in authority, but which actually end up wreaking havoc and destruction upon the society that they're implemented in. And often not until many years later is that recognized. And of course, that applies to Nazi Germany. In fact, that's one of my examples. The other example I'm using is the Cultural Revolution after the failure of the Great Leap. And in both cases, the society had been weakened before the rise of the regime that put these false narratives to the population. And I think that also is something important to bear in mind. We have seen a weakening of some of the structures in our society over the last 30 years or so. And I think you pointed to this a bit when you're talking about the ends of the kind of legacy that we've been given by people who fought and died for freedoms a generation or two ago. And we've had it very easy for a long time, and that breeds, as the saying goes, weakness. And so I think that's another ingredient here that was also jet fueled by the panic to do with COVID. And that then set us on a policy trajectory that we are still, unfortunately, I think, somewhat enslaved to.
Very much so, very much. And again, those words, so we began here about words and the way that they're used. It's interesting, Paul, 1933, same words as in 2024. So not a lot changes. And I want to swing back around, Gigi, to your mention of historical moorings. Would you explain a little more for our viewers the importance of and the relevance of our historical moorings? Because I don't know if you're aware, I know you're at a university, but in general schooling, talking to my grandchildren, the way that history is being taught in school is very different to anything I experienced when I was at school, and the same for my sisters. So we were at school in the 70s, early 60s, 70s, and here we are not that far on, and the way that the stories of history has changed is as if it has been cut, shredded, pasted back, really weird. So what would you both like to say, Gigi? What would you like to say about historical moorings?
Look, I think that the stories we tell each other about who we are and who we are as a people, as well as who we are at local levels like the family, are unbelievably important to our actions and our life trajectory, really, and how our society functions. And there are choices at a national level about how one portrays history. I know people who grew up in post-war Germany, for example, and in their high school education, they received a lot of very emotive instruction around the First and Second World Wars, and they took on a lot of kind of a yoke of shame to do with Germany's role in both of those conflicts. And I can understand the desire to make sure in some sense that the horrors of those two times are recognized and acknowledged, and that the pain of those times is seen. But I also see that there is violence throughout human history, and no historical account is ever perfect. You cannot possibly hope to impart into the brain of a child, even over the course of 18 years, a perfectly accurate sort of story of what has happened in human history. You have to pick and choose. There's just too much otherwise. And so the question of how best to design our national story, our historical curriculum that we feed to students, that we indoctrinate them with, I think is an incredibly important question, and it has not been given the resourcing and the diverse amount of input that it deserves. And instead we end up seeing, certainly in economics, and I'm pretty sure this happens in history as well, kind of a closed shop approach to designing the high school curricula. And it's people who are entrenched, it's sort of a potted plant committee who simply say yes or no to particular modules. And I have no confidence that that kind of system is going to uncover somehow through some mechanism the optimal kind of history and storytelling for Australia, for its future health, wealth, and prosperity that I would think could be discoverable through different mechanisms. So I think what we need is more of a diverse set of perspectives on what needs to be told to our children, and not just have any one person or any one committee, certainly with no community back and forth, no osmosis, no connection with other parts of Australian life, setting just in a vacuum what our children learn.
Absolutely. And Paul, what would you like to add to that?
So much.
Right ahead.
So the whole narrative framework and story framework is fundamentally how our species find structure and navigate through life. And we have such a short lifespan that we are only capable of acquiring firsthand experiences to a very limited extent. Depending on where we're born, when we're born, the people around us, there's quite a subset of experiences that we're exposed to. And so that would tend, without the context and framework of national identity, there's that word again, or cultural identity, then it's really, life is very narrow. And so it's super important that we have an overarching framework that we can align against. And Jordan Peterson speaks quite prolifically about that. And I think I'll introduce an engineering concept here into the conversation. I think the school system is very much focused on teaching what to learn, even that's debatable, rather than how to learn. And whenever you have a problem like that, one tool that can be deployed in defense of that is diversification. So in engineering, particularly in aviation, it's just a fantastic domain to draw a lot of parallels to, because people are largely aware of the safety critical nature of aviation. And I would consider education to be culturally safety critical as well. There's a large amount of redundancy that's built into not only the physical systems on aircraft, but the processes as well. So if some part of a human chain or a mechanical or electrical chain fails for whatever reason, there's usually duplicate or triplicate redundancies that take over. And I think if we apply that type of thinking to the education of our children, if we allow our children to experience varied sources of information, if one of those goes rogue, then it's just one voice in a chorus of contributors that are basically building the narrative structure that they will then go forward and use in deployment of whatever their views are in the political sphere and so forth. And the opposite of that then is to centralize everything. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing in the legislative framework now. Now, centralization introduces, again, in engineering terms, a single point of failure. And when you apply that at the societal level, that's incredibly dangerous. And I don't think we have narratives floating around at the moment that ground us enough to realize the gravity of that danger. It's my hope that we can draw some of these parallels, and that's what I'm attempting to do with the book, is walk through what's happening now and apply it to the echoes of the past, as well as some first principle reasoning that I throw in there as well, because people tend to prefer that, to say that these are certain identifiable patterns that repeat in history. And whenever you have a single point of failure in your culture or your society, it's only a matter of time before it falls apart. And I think the wheels are starting to get a bit wobbly.
I think that's totally true. Can I just interject again? I would like to just draw a parallel to a set of economic concepts, which are quite similar. So we have this concept of competition and the contrasting concept of monopoly or monopsony, where you have a single seller or a single demander. And of course, what we teach our students is the theoretical result from economic analysis that competition with many different sellers will yield higher consumer welfare. And the reason for that is that every single seller is kept on his or her toes by the pressure of other sellers potentially taking his or her market share. And so that competition is a positive force. We may think of it as, I don't want to have to compete. But at a societal level, keeping some competition alive so that nobody has disproportionate dominance means that you out-select through people's choices the bad products, the products that are too pricey, the suppliers who are using production technology that's too wasteful, too costly. And so as a whole society, you move towards a situation in which your resources are used more effectively. Now, in a monopoly or monopsony situation, one supplier or one demander, people don't have choice. There is one place that you have to go to have your transaction in that space. And that's very dangerous. What we see as a theoretical result and an empirical result when you go to data is that in such markets where there is high concentration of economic power, you have higher prices and lower quality and often lower amounts of things being produced. And so you have lower welfare overall, and you have a stagnation of innovation because there is no competitive pressure on the supplier or the demander of labor, let's say, to actually improve his or her processes to make them more efficient and possibly a better quality product. So we have a very similar kind of outtake. And by the way, my father was an engineer as well. So I do very much find it appealing to think about whole of society systems and institutions and the design problem that we face as a people from an engineering standpoint.
Thank you both very much. Again, it opens more and more, doesn't it? It's certainly the biggest onion I've ever seen when it comes to these topics. You mentioned technology and centering, bringing everything to a one point, and then competition. So at the Perth Domestic Airport here, where Qantas has taken over the original airport in Perth, and they've got their own international departure lounge there and their domestic area, however, their cheaper arm has been ousted to the other airport. I found out on a recent visit there that 6 of the eateries at that airport are owned by an American company. The same one American company owns 6 eateries at that airport, and there is not a manager on site. They are watched. The staff told me they are watched from wherever their manager is in the world. That to me is alarming. Where are we going with retail even? Why are people being managed online? And we spoke about this briefly before we came on live about being in person, having that human connection, how important it is. But now, as you're pointing out, both of you, about one point of centre, and then the competition being cut out and what that does, Gigi, to both of you, your opinion on what that does and how that changes society as well. So to find it is actually already occurring here. And if we look at even something like the big supermarkets, when I was a kid, we had the delicatessen on the street corners, and they were always open when other stores weren't. Always that little bit more expensive for sure, but you had more choices. And what we've seen here in Western Australia is the more and more Coles and Woolies have taken over marketplaces. So this goes to what you were saying, Gigi. Then all the little fellas have fallen by the wayside, and they are family businesses. They are people trying to make a difference and earn their own way, and in Paul's words, being responsible for their future, their life themselves. So I think that a lot of what you were talking about with competition and the way it's gone on has been creeping in quite insidiously for a number of years now. And we find that Coles is Wesfarmers is so many other things, but you don't know unless you go and look into these things. So is that all part of this centralising? But what's that going to mean for us when it comes down to things like digital ID and having everything about us in one place? Who would like to go first on that one?
I'm happy to take a stab. So first, let me say I've recognized the dynamic that you're talking about in the U.S. for decades. The rise of Walmart, for example, is a really big phenomenon that changed the look of local neighborhoods a lot. And what was going on there is that Walmart was able to capitalize on production methods that enabled it at scale to produce products at a very, very low price and distribute them at a very low price, right? So there were actual real economic advantages to having such a high scale operation. And it was able to then use those advantages to outcompete many of the mom and pop stores. Now, Walmart still exists in the US, but the US has also gotten beyond the point that I was there, 20 years ago, and seeing the destruction of so many local shops, in the sense that now Walmart is cheek by jowl with other specialty shops that have, as a point of difference, that they sell things you can't get in Walmart. So they have discovered how to distinguish themselves. And because that's allowed, you can still compete. They essentially occupy the niches, the spaces of the market that Walmart is not able to occupy at a competitive advantage. So that's a situation where you have concentration of economic power for, in some sense, an economically justifiable reason. You might say there's actual returns there that Walmart is capitalizing because of the scale of its operations. And you see the same thing with Amazon, for example, and other kinds of large companies where what we say is that there are returns to scale in the technology of production. So we would expect in those kinds of sectors that there would be a monopoly kind of dynamic emerging. And those would be the sectors then that our competition authorities like the ACCC, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, should have a particular eye on to make sure that the advantage gained by those large companies does not eventually then, once they have basically no competition left, turn into an exploitation of consumers. So that's basically the job of the ACCC. Now, in the case of centralizing something like who is able to say their opinion about a particular contentious issue, so I'm thinking of the misinformation/disinformation bill, the centralization of that authority to speak truth, I think, is even much, much more dangerous than the centralization of economic authority in a particular dimension of life, groceries or clothing or whatever, because essentially it empowers the government not to preserve competition, but to do the very reverse. So no longer is the government then under that kind of bill and the enforcement of that kind of bill tasked with protecting the consumer through ensuring that diversity of choice, for example, is still to some extent preserved, and that the person or company that has a lot of power is not exploiting the consumer, but rather the government is implicitly given the role of suppression of competition. So it's the absolute opposite than the role that we teach our students the government is supposed to have. So I'll stop there. There's plenty more to say. I'm sure Paul will chip in a lot.
Yeah, Paul, thank you, Gigi. There sure is. As I say, this is a big onion. Paul, what would you like to add on that?
Yeah, look, I had to laugh there, Gigi, when you mentioned the role of the ACCC, in particular, keeping an eye on centralisation, because I can tell you what, if there's one model of centralisation, it's federal governments in particular,
Yep.
And particularly their self-preserving architecture that seeks to use whatever means at their disposal to maintain that centralisation. And Gwenda, you started off talking about surveillance and how people in Perth Airport there are watched. And, centralised surveillance is centralised knowledge. And centralised knowledge is centralised power. And we have to ask ourselves, if we zoom out for a little bit, why the interest in surveilling us? We don't put surveillance cameras out in, parts of the land that aren't populated, or there's something about the human species that is worth surveilling. And I think that goes into the topic of identity. So I make the case in my book that human beings are the ultimate resource. Humans create technologies. They're the bedrock of building civilizations. They're the resource from which everything else is derived. So there's an inherent value in that, in observing how humans behave. And the means or the mechanism to do that are our identity characteristics. So we talked about this, and we spoke a little bit about what is human identity in our last chat, Gwenda, and we went a little bit into how difficult it is to define. But one way to think about it is, when we walk around in the world, we express ourselves in certain ways. Picture those old cartoons or movies where you have the jailer, with the big loop of keys. He's got dozens of keys on it. You can picture our identities like that ring of keys. So every key is like, your age, your residential address, your phone number. They're just little micro keys that give you a little bit of exposure to the person you are. So when we hand out these keys, often it seems innocuous because, it's a micro key, but you don't know when you hand out that identity key what the organization or individual you've given it to will do to it. You can copy keys. And with our identities, you can't just change the locks. So if we consider our identity as micro keys to our valuable resources, which they are, the more you know about someone, the more you can exploit them, the more you can manipulate them, the more you can blackmail them, It's a gateway, an avenue into impacting their life for your advantage. There are many other examples of that. So I view this surveillance and centralization from a high level as indicative of how valuable we are, and by extension, how important it is to put protective measures between us and those who will surveil us, because it's then a simple step forward to understanding that there is certain, every time you see a camera on you, you say, well, that means I'm valuable, right? And that means that I'm worth protecting. So the more that predatory system is centralized, it snowballs. The easier it is to deploy certain technologies to extract more out of people. And this is possibly a good segue into what I think we're seeing now as surveillance capitalism, which perhaps could be viewed as a derivative economy of the traditional forms of slavery. So, in times gone, slave owners would physically own slaves, and like a piece of equipment, they would need to maintain them. So that means, in the human case, housing them, feeding them. There'd be downtime when they were sick. There was a direct investment, to use a crude word, in that human resource. But because now we have these micro identity keys that are easily surveilled and easily exchanged behind the scenes, I think that's a way to form a derivative market that is quite valuable to those who have access to this data. And of course, we're blind to it. If you were an actual slave, you'd very much know it. But we maintain ourselves. We operate under the illusion that we are largely free despite all of this surveillance, and we don't know what valuable identity is being leaked through that surveillance, and we don't know how it will come back to bite us. So there's a bit to unpack there, but just some thoughts.
Can I just talk a bit about that?
You might.
Yeah.
Like I of course completely agree about the centralization of these digital identity markers, keys, as you will. There are a couple of things. First of all, on the bureaucracy and the sclerotic nature of the current machinery of state, shall we say, at the federal level. Couldn't agree more. I've written about this on Brownstone, so brownstone.org. You can find all my blogs there, and with Michael Baker and Paul Fighters, my co-author, on this wonderful book here. We've done a lot of blogs, including one exactly about this. We say how to untie the modern Gordian knots, or something like this, calling them Gordian knots. So when I talk about the ACCC, I'm talking about the vision that was that underpinned the creation of the ACCC, and indeed the vision that underpinned the creation of the federal systems in Australia, the United States, in Europe as well, was not one of excessive centralized control. In fact, in each of those cases, extreme efforts were made at the institution's founding to prevent that, to in fact push power down to the local level, the local regions, the local states, the constituent countries, and really just have an extremely limited, almost, only these things may you do kind of role for the federal system or the federal institutions. But unfortunately, in all of those cases, what has happened over the ensuing decades is a gradual encroachment, a gradual mission brief increase, right? A kind of constant expansion, as you say, following the logic of bureaucracy. Number one rule of bureaucracy: keep itself alive, and if possible, expand. And we saw the same exact problem in the time of Franz Kafka. Kafkaesque comes from that time, right? The Austro-Hungarian Empire and the scleroticism there, and the absurdity of it, and the same thing as well in the Soviet Union at the time. And you just couldn't get anything done. There was so much that was officially established that was a complete inefficient waste of time, and so everything that actually got done was done around the systems. So I completely agree about that, and it's one of the reasons why I think when we talk about we should put safeguards, the best safeguard is not to have that central control. Rather than to think, we can establish another agency that will do that. I mean, there's a call, in fact, it's just happened a few months ago, to establish the Australian Centre for Disease Control and Prevention, the opposite direction to what we should be going in after the failures of the COVID era. But many people think that's what we need because they have been trained to have a knee-jerk reaction that if there's a social problem, we must look to government to provide the funds, the subsidy, or the ministry to solve that problem. And unfortunately, without the historical moorings we were talking about before, of understanding that, in fact, usually that's not the right way to go. Usually you want want to keep power and control and resources disseminated for the protection of the society, people will, again, be subject to going along with those kinds of policies. Now, one final thing, the notion of human identity. I actually don't identify much with my address or my age, or for that matter, my gender or my height or my color of eye or anything else like that, even my skin color. I don't really identify with those things. I do strongly identify with my profession, with my role in my family, with my national identity, with my sort of physical capabilities, you know, a marathon runner, for example, or a singer, right? And so really the kinds of things that we are thinking about handing over to the government in this digital ID are not perfectly aligned with the way that a lot of humans actually construct their psychological identity and live their lives. And I think that is a route to more freedom, to suppressing this encroaching enslavement, as you call it, and actually living our lives according to what we believe our lives really are worth. And to me, my life is much more than where I live and what the color of my skin or my eyes is, or anything about me demographically. It is very much what I am to the people I love and to the societies I love, and how I contribute to those societies, and why I'm doing what I'm doing. And those things are not reducible to a piece of data that one can put into a government digital ID program. So I think people should not be consumed with their fear that their actual identity will be usurped. You can maintain your identity. Slavery is a mindset that you can avoid through defining yourself in a healthier and more human way.
Thank you,
If I could
Gigi.
just jump in there again, Gwenda. That's a
Yes, please do.
fantastic
Please do.
set of observations there, Gigi. And you're right, not identifying with many of the square peg, round hole traits that we shoehorn together in a bundle of sticks to identify ourselves with certain levels of certainty. Yet submitting these characteristics to these national digital ID systems doesn't truly reflect who we are. But what it does do is it builds a hyper-granular platform for discrimination. Yep. So that opens up a number of different attack vectors that many people won't see coming. You can be discriminated on any sort of slice or view or lens into the way you radiate into the world, and it may not be one that you particularly identify with. And we've seen that repeat throughout history again. But just to go back to what you started talking about, I think with the bureaucracy, the growing bureaucracy, I think we see that the classic modern example of that is Elon Musk saying, just mind-blowingly, it takes longer to get the regulatory approval for a large rocket than to build the rocket itself. And I mean, surely that single observation represents the end state of human progress in a very visceral sense. Unless we do something about that very thing, we're a stagnant species slipping back down the hill from here, I'm afraid.
Can I just make an observation about that? So another blog on Brownstone asks the question, are we at the end of progress? That I wrote with Paul and Michael. And we do see, of course, these very corrosive and decayed kind of dynamics that pain us greatly, being proponents of the West and children of the West. We want the West to survive and thrive. And we see ourselves very much, talking of identity, as proponents of resistance to the current encroachment of authority and centralized power, and also proponents of the restoration of the health of the West. But we do believe it's possible. The question is how we get there and how many years it's going to take. Part of the reason why I think it's inevitable that we will rediscover a path of progress and hope and optimism is still very much alive within me for this, is that basically a lot of these systems ultimately fail in history. They have failed because of their own innate inefficiency. It's just true that a society that has more centralized power and more centralization of resources and say on all sorts of aspects of life will end up wasting a lot more than a society where power is diffuse and control is diffuse. We've seen that again and again through history. Now, if you look at, for example, the Austro-Hungarian Empire example or the Russian, Soviet Union example, in both cases, that system came undone in some way violently. Right? There was a really horrible period of destruction in the case of the USSR. It was 6 years of human suffering until GDP finally started to recover after the fall of the Union. And, you know, in the case of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, basically defeat on the battlefield. So I certainly hope that that is not what we are going to have to go through in the West to restore our societies and resume our march towards progress and higher human well-being and happiness. But I think it's possible, and I think we will find a way somehow to continue that march. It's just a question, as I say, of how long, and what can we do now to mitigate the risk of actual bloodshed and destruction as much as we can, as we try to bridge that gap until that point of resuming progress.
Good question, Gigi. Does it come down to Paul's mission of empowering individuals to take ownership of their lives and their responsibilities? So does that come down to doing something different in the way we educate people, the way we educate them about the word safety, about the word health, about the word wealth? You know, everything we've talked about points at a system that has used those words for decades and decades, hundreds of years really, as the pivotal words for capturing the minds, capturing the everyday person, to then handing over their responsibility. As you said a moment ago, they look to the government to provide funding and provide answers. And from this point where I sit and the conversations I hear, it seems to lean more to the majority that are in that bubble than those who are in perhaps our bubble. So how do we avoid the bloodshed? How do we avoid people being consumed by these cameras, by the belief that digital ID is for their safety, their wealth, and their health? Do we need to educate differently?
I certainly try to in my classes. Paul, I'm sure that you try it through your books. I mean, I do for my books as well. Thank you for the entree. I have to also plug a new higher education experiment happening called Nova Academia, so novacad.org. The whole point of my being involved with that is very much to try to change the way we educate students about their societies, what actually is happening in their societies, and what actually health is all about, how we could use our incredibly rich resources available to us today to meaningfully improve people's health, whereas the current systems we have often are failing us. And that is also true in other systems like the legal system or the media system. Of course, this is an independent media, so that's wonderful, but there are many systems that we rely on to service human needs of different points, at different points in our lives, and in different realms, which are failing and have been shown to fail, particularly in the last few years. So I think what we need to do is indeed activate people to try to be useful in reconstruction in whatever area they have talents in. That may be education, that may be in law, that may be in the media, or even in health, and to continue to speak out and to continue to joyfully, with happiness and compassion for other people, point out that there is another way. Just there is another way. That is the most important message, because indeed, if you don't think there's another way, you feel trapped, you feel enslaved, you feel captured, you are captured. And then you start making excuses in your mind about why it's okay that you're captured. Very dangerous trajectory to go on. So instead, just try to open people's minds to the possibility that there is another way. And you can use examples from history. You can use examples from other countries. You can start a new organization and demonstrate that there is another way, which is what we're trying to do with Nova Academia and also with Australians for Science and Freedom, of course, scienceandfreedom.org. And indeed, in the Great COVID Panic, we used some humor as well to try to demonstrate, you don't have to think the way that you were told to think in the mainstream way, mainstream narrative. There were other paths available to you to understand what was happening in your world. So I think that is probably the most important, simple message that you can try to convey to others when you talk to them and give to them as a mantra. They truly can be feeling happier and more comfortable and more safe if they know that there is another way.
Thank you, Gigi. Paul?
I think I resonate with a lot of that, Gigi. I think the positivity component and the exploiting your God-given gifts component in whatever area that might be they're a very powerful duopoly that can really help to steer this ship into a better direction. But before I elaborate on perhaps the types of things we can look at doing going forward, I just wanted to pop back quickly to what you were saying about how sometimes paths like this end violently. And it reminded me of a quote I put in my book, actually, which I thought was quite relevant. And this is from Dr. Bruce Shepard, who in 1987 made this comment. He was the AMA president, actually, and he made this comment in relation to the Australia card at the time. Given the horrific impact the card will have on Australia, its defeat would almost be worth fighting a civil war for. That was the AMA president in 1987. Now, boy, how times have changed, right? But it spoke a little bit to, well, it says a lot of things to me. One is it says it recognizes that these things can, when unchecked, end violently. And I also think it speaks to a degree of principled character that was displayed during that era, and I hope is just asleep and not dead in our country at the moment. I'm fairly positive that it still exists. But yeah, talking about what we can do going forward in the educational component, I mentioned before that I think positivity and working to your talents or your capabilities is quite important. So there are a few areas I think that may help get people thinking along those lines. When I was writing my book, I researched Aadhaar, which is India's centralized digital identity system. I believe it's the world's largest biometric digital ID system. And because I've worked in technology for some time, I happen to know quite a few Indians in technology. And I talked to one of them, a colleague of mine, who's an Indian citizen and lives in Australia at the moment. And he talked at length about the effect that Aadhaar had particularly on him. And he said that one observation he made is once systems like that become entrenched in the business stack, so when private businesses or organizations start building upon these national identity frameworks, then they become very deeply rooted and entrenched. So I guess from a business sense, from both sides, whether you're a patron or you run a business, it would be worth keeping in mind what systems you apply on top of national digital ID, and would certainly urge keeping parallel systems in place, certainly in your private life. I think there's a great opportunity, not just to avoid the dangers of centralized digital ID, but just for a better life as well, to start learning about the concept of digital minimalism. I think a lot of people run into technology with open arms, and it doesn't really rate a mention what that impact has on your life. So certainly there's a security element to it. You know, the prolific use of digital navigation just leaves high resolution breadcrumbs that people might be alarmed at. And maybe we can go a little bit later into the nature of digital data and how people don't particularly understand how that can be misused. So yeah, if a system like this does come in, like it was legislated on May 16th here, it's certainly not the end of the world. And perhaps the silver lining is it offers us a motivation to explore other areas where we can reduce our digital profile. There's a saying in the army, go to ground or get small. You know, if you're getting shot at by something, reducing your attack vector or your profile certainly doesn't stop you getting shot at, but it reduces the risk to yourself. In terms of the professional space as well, we've talked about how our different professions very much overline. But at the end of the day, these systems are built by someone. So there are software engineers who will be given the task of coding these systems up. Now, these are moments where people can make individual decisions that very much influence the direction of entire nations. So I would say the collective inaction of thousands of engineers and technicians avoiding building systems that can be weaponized by rogue governments or perhaps even AI as it develops further, I think itself is an act of democracy. So when you work in your professions, just have a think about what you're doing in terms of the big picture. And that could be one area to educate yourself on as well. I also think for those more technically minded, and again, Gigi, you said there are other ways, very much applicable to the technical space. I think it may be lost on some people that there are certainly, by almost every metric, better ways to do identification, assuming identification is something we actually want to do. And that's another possible area we can talk about. I maintain that we have an obsession with identification as a proxy for things that we don't really understand. And there are other ways to structure our society and build relational and institutional trust at scale using, for example, one thing I propose is a reputation-based society that we could possibly look at migrating towards and reduce our fascination with identity. But even if we do want to identify ourselves, there's a technology called SSI, which is self-sovereign identity. It's built on the concept of verifiable credentials. I don't want to get too technical, but it very much embraces the concept of decentralization that we've talked about as a manner of moderating how we use technology to exchange enough information to trust each other, to exchange goods or services or information. So certainly if you're technically minded and you want to look up SSI and particularly the technology behind it, zero knowledge proofs, which is quite interesting. It turns out that we can very much share information about ourselves without leaking the type of exploitable information. And by that, I mean, you may face a situation where you have to be over 18 to, I don't know, see a movie or do something. The way we do that now is we usually share some sort of government issued ID, which by the way, leaks a bunch of other information that the person you're giving it to can see. But they use the birth date as a proxy to derive your age. What ZKP allows you to do is just to verify to the gatekeeper that you are above that age, not what your age is. So that's the kind of concept behind that technology. It's a current technology. There are entrepreneurs around the world, many of whom I actually know and assisted me in creating the book, are building SSI-based global identity systems right now. So we could certainly save our nation a lot of money from this system, the centralized system we're building now, by just adopting, what will hopefully be standardized practice that's being built in the private sector. So there are lots of different niche areas that I guess people could start getting granular about in terms of educating themselves and different sides of the coin, I suppose, in this, what is basically a very ephemeral and large area.
Thanks, Paul, very much. And you alluded to people embracing technology with open arms. At the moment, there's an ad out called Apple Intelligence, and you can now have your Apple device take over your intelligence. So my question to people is, where is your human intelligence? And where are your, to use Gigi's words, your moorings in your human intelligence? To have a phone or any kind of smart device, it's another word that we didn't cover, but smart has popped up everywhere, even down to McDonald's using it. They now have a smart burger. I'm not sure how that works, but they have a smart burger. So it's this infiltration of the words that we were talking about before. And Paul, you're talking about people embracing technology with open arms. The AI, for example, where people are using AI to write the full book or to write mantras, to write prayers even, astounds me, given my work in the spiritual field, horrifies me actually. To write meditations, seriously, it doesn't belong there, people. So really stepping into your humanness for a start. Don't just think technology has all the answers for you. You actually have the answers. And as Gigi and Paul have talked about, being able to look at our historical moorings and find that we haven't done so well over all these years, all these hundreds of years. The history's not really good with us learning about not being controlled, not having someone or an entity stand over us and tell us how life is going to be. And a really simple part of that is Facebook. And I'll put my hand up and say when it first came out, I didn't want any part of it. But then family and friends were like, oh, you have to be on it because it's so good. We can connect so easily. It was a really good con job, wasn't it? It's a funny part of the technology that everyone, well, sorry, not everyone, most people leapt into and these days are very reliant on, with finding out what everyone's doing. And Paul, you were talking about the slithers of identification. Well, if only people realised how much is known about them because of their activity on Facebook. Something so simple, a beautiful social platform that allowed you to be connected everywhere with everyone. So when you're overseas, click, click, show everyone where you are and that you're not home. Show everyone all sorts. So this whole concept of digital ID, and whether we do, as Gigi talked about and Paul alluded to, it's not about how we identify ourselves by skin colour, by even nationality. It goes beyond that. But the digital ID, where maybe your pupil, your thumbprint, fingerprint is utilised in ways that you're not even going to know about. And as Paul said, why are we so interesting that we need to be surveilled? Why are we so interesting that we need to be watched in everything we're doing? Who really needs to do that? So putting it down on a very basic way of life, putting everything together that Paul and Gigi have shared with us today, and coming back to the roots of what it is to be a human, what it is to be in a family, whether that family is your immediate family or whether it is your collective family of friends and extended family, whatever you call that. But those are things that need to be held dear and really treasured. You're here in this world to have what's called a human experience. Some would say we have been an experiment. Well, I would say we have been experimented on for a long time, and that continues. But as both Gigi and Paul have got in their books and in their blogs, there are ways for us to be able to, what do you call it, Paul? Go small when the bullets are coming your way, and Gigi talking about how you see yourself, your identification. Really start to investigate yourself. See where you sit in your life and in what you call your sphere of life. Because my world is different to Gigi's, it's different to Paul's, and it will be different to yours. But you need to understand where you sit and what are you all about in your world and then out into the greater world. Gigi, is there anything further that you would like to share with our audience before we close off?
I might just make one remark of encouraging compassion for those in our circles who are subjected to these sorts of threats and succumb to them. Oftentimes, these things are done on a very small scale level, a little tiny decision out of a lack of energy, a little bit of laziness. There's just a giving in to the seduction of an easy way in this moment. I think that kind of seduction happens in many, many cases when there is a gradual encroachment of what is actually an enslavement technology. So have compassion for those people and try to provide some energy and an alternative way for them to find the energy to resist those kinds of temptations, that kind of giving in to one's laziness, to one's sense of, oh yeah, okay, just this one time, oh, this will be fine. You know, if you're the business that doesn't want to take cash, oh, it's just too hard. I don't want to have to go to the bank and get the coins, right? Just a little bit of inconvenience. Encourage people to see the value of taking that inconvenience on and actually proudly saying, okay, I recognize that there is a broader societal benefit here from me and other people of like mind actually not giving in to those kinds of seductions, and we will find a better way. We will find a more efficient way for everybody, more easily with less violence, if we keep pushing against what is really a centralization trajectory. So I think that kind of compassion we do need. We shouldn't be rejecting people who are tempted by these kinds of technologies.
No, it's again about becoming more aware. Thank you, Gigi. Paul, what would you like to add to close off our conversation?
That's you're speaking very much, Gigi, there about the essence of being human. That's a really good takeaway, and I would expand on that a little bit to, I guess, highlight our role as mentors and particularly parents. So a lot of this discussion has been based on how do we deal with the symptoms of the problems that were seeded a long time ago. But let's not forget that there are seeds alive right now, human seeds alive right now, who are learning from us. And we can't be focused purely on fighting the symptoms of past decisions. I think there's a role in mentoring the young and really nurturing and taking custody of that responsibility. And there's a nice technical parallel I see playing out at the moment, just to wrap this up in terms of parenting, and that is AI. So AI, as many people know, relies on an extensive training process. Now, there's a lot of data that goes in to these systems, and it's very computationally intensive, but these systems need to learn. They are like children. And I think that's all fantastic, except when you overlay the legislative censorship, because what you're doing there is you're feeding these very powerful systems with a highly curated view of the world. And we need to treat ourselves as, like we talked about before, giving these systems, like we do a healthy child, a range of exposures to different points of view. So as they learn, they also curate in their own minds the ability to rationalize and reason, discard those inputs that just seem to be outliers or anomalies. So yeah, I think it's just maybe a little poetic that we're going into this new AI dawn, and our relationship with AI, I think, very much models our in the home responsibilities as parents. So don't forget the youth. We have to deal with the symptoms of what has already gone by, but we need to make sure that the seeds being sown now are, commensurate with our values and principles.
Thank you, Paul. Paul, would you like to talk a little bit about where people, or do we know yet, where people can get your book that's about to be released, author of Citizen One?
Thank you. Yes. Look, it's getting pretty exciting now. I hope it will be available, at least in paperback and ebook format, possibly as early as next week. I don't have an exact date yet, but look, the best thing would be to go to my website, paulgconlon.com, or citizen1book.com. That's ONE. And either follow me on the socials there or sign up to my mailing list, and I'll keep everyone informed there. But it's very close now.
Thank you. Great. And Gigi, is there somewhere that you would like to direct people or invite them to go for any of your writings, blogs, anything at all?
Well, I'm not on Facebook or Instagram or X. I've never been on any of those things, although I was defamed on Twitter when it was Twitter back in 2020. So I've mentioned, I think, a few already. Scienceandfreedom.org is the free think tank, cross-disciplinary, that I founded jointly with a few others last year. We are having our second annual Progress Through Science and Freedom conference coming up in mid-November, November 15 to 17 at RMIT in Melbourne. So I'd encourage people to check that out. Nova Academia, Novacad, NOVACAD.org. There is also an advertisement on that page if you follow the breadcrumbs to the December boot camp that I'm organizing here for interested Australian youngsters aged 18 to 30, very much taking Paul's advice to try to really be paying attention to the youth in our age. And of course, my blog's on Brownstone, the publisher of The Great COVID Panic. And you can find that at brownstone.org, and then just go to my page and you can see all the blogs that I've written there. But we have a newsletter for ASF. You can certainly subscribe to that for free. It's a monthly newsletter which will be going out end of this month and every month. But I don't have a page, socials or anything like this. So people just have to, I think, use those mechanisms, and hopefully I'll see people at an in-person event sometime, because I do quite a lot of them.
That'd be great. Thank you both very much. Gigi Foster and Paul Conlon, thank you for your time. Thank you for our audience for joining. Please remember to share this and share these thoughts so that we do have a stronger bond as humans and for the future of humanity. Our children today, our children tomorrow. Thank you both very much. Bye for now.